Welcome to AI in Action, Exploring Tomorrow's Tech Today, the podcast where we delve into the groundbreaking world of artificial intelligence. I'm Mari, and with me is my husband, Jim. With our combined expertise in technology and education, we're here to guide you through the AI revolution. Whether it's the latest news headlines or transformative AI applications in classrooms, healthcare, and beyond, we're here to make sense of it all. Together, let's uncover how AI is reshaping our world from everyday encounters to the future of work. So let's dive in and explore tomorrow's tech today. Welcome to AI in Action, Exploring Tomorrow's Tech Today. My name is Mari, and I'm here with Jim. Today, we are going to be talking about this week's headlines that caught our attention. The first thing that caught my attention was there were a lot of regulation headlines out there. Headlines like New York City a few days ago, they came out in the Wall Street Journal with an article about regulating AI that's used in hiring tools.
It's an interesting choice, too, as a place to start. I'm kind of surprised they started there because it's a kind of a weird, hard line to walk when you start talking about bias in hiring. So, didn't you used to be a small business owner?
Yes, actually, I was. And one of the things that caught my attention about this specific article was that they were going to make people bring in a third party to audit if they use tools that use AI in their hiring practices, which is concerning because that's more money that the small businesses are going to have to pay.
And what was it like for you as a small business owner to have third parties come in and audit you or look at your business? How did that usually work?
Well, I never could get them to show up. I mean, a lot of times they were I'm in a small town. So a lot of times I had a hard time finding anyone that I could trust. I didn't know anybody. I had to figure out what other businesses were doing to handle this additional thing that I was having to pay for. So it was very, very painful.
Exactly. That's why I've kind of wondering about that one.
So now California has had a chatbot law for a long time. I think this happened like years ago that they said, hey, if you're going to have a chatbot, period, that's not a human behind that chatbot, which isn't necessarily an AI at the time. It could have just been something that was like
an Alexa,
a command.
Yeah.
You ask it a question, it automatically comes back like a canned response. They've had that law in place to where they have to tell you that you're not talking to a human. So
yeah, they started that before ChatGPT went into the national consciousness. So I suspect that I don't think they really knew about that, but really the idea behind it is to let you know that, hey, whoever you're talking to is not a human. So I'm not exactly sure what they were trying to accomplish with that, but it's an interesting approach.
And it's going to be relevant to artificial intelligence. So they're not really going to have to change anything about that law. Copyright battles against OpenAI, they have begun, and they've been here for a while. So courts is where this article was at.
Yeah, you knew this was coming because there's been a lot of discussions. Everybody has realized that AIs are being trained on their data, and now everybody's realized their data has some value, and so the lawsuits have begun. The lawyers are out in droves, and I suspect there's going to be a lot of precedent-setting cases coming up, specifically. A lot of people watching this case.
Yes. The other thing was regulatory updates. Now, when I saw this article, it was basically about all around the world. It was an AIbusiness.com. It was an older article, but I asked you to go ahead and start digging a little bit into what was happening with regulations and AI, because I really wanted us to sit down and explain to everybody through this podcast about regulations that are headed their way.
Yeah, I was looking for some more current ones, and once you asked me to look into this one, I realized that it's actually still pretty accurate. So we can talk a little more about that in a minute, but a lot of stuff hasn't changed. Governments move slowly. They make a lot of noise, press releases, things like that, but they don't tend to move at a very fast rate when it comes to that because they've got a lot of different aspects of these things they have to look at, I suppose, before they actually pass a law.
So all the committees are forming, and all the people are getting asked to come and do all the testifying, and
The
all those
lobbyists,
things in the background are happening.
the lobbyists are lining up to make sure their views are heard. And we've talked about that before. That's kind of a difficult thing. As I've said before, I did testify before one of these committees you're talking about. And it tends to be the people who have the most to lose or gain, or usually lose, are the ones that get the smallest voice in that. There's terms that people use like government capture, which basically means that the government regulations, they want to make sure that whatever they get happens favors their company. And since the companies tend to be big, and the companies that are getting the mind share of the government officials are big, then they kind of capture it, and whatever's left, whatever happens, the small guys, like when you own your small business, they tend to get stomped on pretty hard if they're not careful. So
That's a good segue into another article that I saw from the New York Times, and it was talking about the little guys needing big friends.
yeah, when you start talking about little companies and the barriers to entry, you and I have mentioned that before. You start talking about barriers. There's a lot of different barriers. AI has its own set of unique problems because it's not one of those things, if you're going to train your own models or something, that you can just grab your desktop PC and suddenly you're going to train a model. It doesn't work that way. So when you're going to get the training, a lot of the CPU, the GPU specifically, that are available are being captured by the big companies. I'd read that Tesla bought a whole bunch of GPUs, and Microsoft obviously has a bunch, and NVIDIA is loving it all. Now they're $1 trillion company because they sell 80% of the GPUs in the world. But these big guys are capturing a lot of that horsepower that's needed to really train new models if you want to do something unique.
So what are the little guys going to do?
Well, that was what's interesting about the headline. Is the idea is that I read sort of a second headline that was similar to it, and they were talking about the crypto miners. Turns out crypto miners bought a lot of GPUs, and anyone that's been paying attention, like for example Tom Brady, who I think he lost $30 million in crypto mining. The crypto mining companies, some of them are going under, or they're having a hard time making money, but they bought a lot of GPUs. So they're saying, hey, we've got a lot of GPUs. Why don't we start leasing those out to other people? Hopefully, not all of that will also be captured by the big guys, and maybe some of the little guys. So maybe the crypto miners are going to come to the rescue of these little companies.
Okay. So what's next? What about the little article in ARS Technica that said that ChatGPT users were dropping for the first time because people were going to like uncensored chatbots and things like that? Do you think that people are going to stop using ChatGPT? I think what's happening is that people are the ones that were the tire kickers, as you call them. They're done. They've asked all the silly questions. They've seen if they can get it to say stuff that it shouldn't say. They've done all those ridiculous things, and now they're bored with it, and they're going back to what they normally do.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of comments, which I enjoyed the comments, actually. There was a lot of comments that agreed with that statement, that the initial tire kickers, the novelty of it wears off and people move on. And, the concern I have is that when you start there's like two camps. One that's trying to say, well, people are tired of it. It's not a big deal anymore. It's going to go away. They're trying to get you to believe that. And then there's the group that say it's going to bring about the end times. So I think those people are the ones that I'm concerned about because, as you well know, I love this stuff. I think it's a great tool. But I think the hard work is just about to begin, where you've got to figure out, you got this great tool. What do I do with it?
Well, hard work. The UN Security Council is going to hold its first ever meeting about the threat of AI.
Yeah, and again, that's what concerns me, is the narrative is being driven at these government levels by people that are seeing this as a threat. They're seeing this as bad. And I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be some kind of regulation or guardrails or whatever you want to call it. But I think all of this loud noise about it bringing the end of the world, it just seems kind of alarmist to me. But maybe I'm just a positive thinker when it comes to this stuff.
Doesn't it seem like something we've heard before?
It does.
It,
For those of us who've been around a while, every time a new piece of technology really gets everybody's imagination going, there tends to be a group that screams loudly about how it's going to bring the end of the world. And, this is one of those things. So let's talk about what happened when the World Wide Web was first created. It was going to, I know in education, which is our real field that we're in education, there was a lot of discussion about kids weren't going to be able to think anymore and, bad things were going to happen. So
I know there was an article a long time ago. You pulled it up. It's the World Wide Web. It's by a person by the name of Tim Berners-Lee.
yeah,
It's like August of 1996, which is
yeah.
amazing that this stuff is just happening again. I mean, the article is very much so relevant to what we're all thinking right now about artificial intelligence.
Well, and the thing is that he identified a set of potential problems, which I think that when you look at what he was, if you look at that article and what he said is that you've got to have questions need to be asked about safety, security, copyrights, protecting minors. If you read these articles you and I have been talking about, that sounds really familiar. How do we make sure this is safely used? How do we make sure that people's data is secure and private? How do we deal with the copyright lawsuits? We just talked about that. The copyright lawsuits have begun. People are posting stuff and they don't have ownership of it. Or back then it was about these people that were indexing the web and the fact that they were showing news articles that contained data or things from, the Wall Street Journal or whatever, and they didn't actually own it. So there was a lot of those discussions, and that was, again, 1996. So the thing that I feel like happened back then that they need to pay attention to is I think most governments took a light touch approach to
Yes.
regulation.
That brings us to the regulations that are happening right now. Let's dive into that for just a little bit. What is going on around the world? So, Canada.
Yeah, it's funny because when I started looking into this, I kind of was thinking, everybody was doing something. Canada, it appears, is taking kind of a wait and see approach. I think the term the article read was modified risk-based approach. They don't really know what they want to do with it, so I think they're just doing a wait and see. Let's see what everybody else does, and U.S., China, all that other stuff, and we'll make our adaptations or laws, regulations based on that.
So, what is China doing?
China is looking at it very seriously because, first of all, China wants to own it.
Yes.
But, the Great Firewall of China, they don't really they want to make sure that what these algorithms are saying do or do not say the things that go along with what China says is okay. So they're actually putting in some thoughts into this that are not bad thoughts, but you can tell based on their focus that it's really about making sure it doesn't go off in the weeds and start talking about things that China doesn't think that people should be talking about.
All right. And then the EU. So the EU, they are starting to, Artificial Intelligence Act. It's a proposal that they've just come up with. Well, I say just come up with. It was in 2021. It was their first attempt to regulate it. So I noticed in this article that they've actually taken it and they've put it into levels to where they have a high risk level, which is something that they say is like critical infrastructure, law enforcement, things like that. And then they have a low risk, which is or limited or minimal risk, which is your video gaming and your chat bots and all of that. And then they have something that they are calling banned, or it's not high risk. What was it that they called it? They called it I
don't know, but I kind of like some of their classifications. They're very aggressive. The EU is typically their aggressiveness is kind of strange because they talk a lot about privacy, but we'll talk about the UK in a minute. But if you look at, I think London is the most watched city in the world. So they're about privacy, but maybe not. I think it's more about online privacy. So when you look at what they're doing and how they're trying to at least categorize the types of, I believe that I would classify and using an AI in a critical infrastructure or law enforcement or something like that is definitely high risk because you can do some really bad things if you make bad decisions in those kinds of environments. So I see that.
The other one was actually called unacceptable. It was an unacceptable risk, something they're not even going to consider, and that's when it had citizens' livelihoods and was like getting rid of rights of people. That was unacceptable, and they weren't even going to talk about that. That wasn't going to
Well,
be allowed. So
again, you talk about safety and your livelihoods. That's where it gets really, I mean, it's easy to say that, but it's really tough to decide how to regulate that. So they're trying to be aggressive, but I think you and I talked about it before. Some of the stuff they're talking about, the businesses aren't in love with because they feel like it's going to squash the AI efforts in the UK. So I think Europe and the UK both have a lot to think about.
so what about the United States? What's the United States doing?
Well, it appears they're mainly driving everything toward the states. Originally, when I was looking at it, they were talking about NIST. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I actually visited them before, and I tend to think they're a great organization. But what they do typically is they make frameworks, and in this case, they made a volunteer risk management framework. They have a security framework. They have lots of frameworks, and I find them personally to be useful. I'm not sure that they're focused on that as heavy as it would. It seemed like that was the lead for a while with the United States, but I'm not sure that's still the lead.
So
But
there are no federal regulations in place right now
no,
at the U.S. level.
no. Most of it's being pushed to the state levels,
Okay.
I think, and we've looked at that a little bit. There's a lot of stuff going on at state levels. That unfortunately could have a very bad effect. They talked about that a lot with when the World Wide Web was coming about, having they were trying to have they didn't want to kill the internet and the commerce, so they passed some rules about how you can regulate it to try to make it common across the United States. Even things like there was years where they weren't allowed to charge sales tax on some of these online. I don't know if that was a good thing or bad, but it was an attempt to keep it for the states from making this patchwork quilt of stuff.
So in the last few minutes of our podcast today, let's talk about what is it that these articles all had in common.
Well, one of the things that was interesting to me is when you asked me to look into this stuff a little bit, I found that old article and I wasn't paying a lot of attention because it popped up on a feed that I hadn't seen before. So I thought, okay, must be new. And then when we started talking about it, I went back and looked and okay, this was old. I thought, wow, great. I just wasted a bunch of time looking over something that probably doesn't apply anymore. But they had kind of three different focuses, I guess you would say, in the stuff that was written a long time ago, which were ethics and fairness, protection against harmful impacts, needs for oversight and standards. These were kind of the three major common themes. The interesting thing is that really hasn't changed much. Some of the focus has shifted slightly, like China is really heavily scrutinizing algorithms more than they were earlier, but it seems like it hasn't changed a lot.
So they all had that in common.
They did then and they do now.
Okay. And what do they have different? Whenever you look at the differences that they had, the intensity is different. I mean, we just talked about Canada versus the EU is taking a more comprehensive and stricter approach towards AI compared to everybody else.
Yeah, they are. And again, businesses over there are complaining because they're afraid it's going to kill the whole market. They're very heavily focused on the privacy. I think at one point the OpenAI people had said they were going to, if they passed some of the regulations, they were going to turn off ChatGPT in Europe. We saw a similar thing not long ago in Italy, where Italy banned the use of, I think it was ChatGPT got banned there for a little bit.
So, yes.
And a lot of theirs is about privacy. And you and I have talked about that a little bit too, in terms of how the training works, whose material gets used for training. And you mentioned a contest that Google had where they were trying to make it forget. Remember the discussion?
Yes.
And
Yes.
How do you make it forget without lobotomizing the AI to where it becomes useless? Or we've all know if you use ChatGPT a lot, you've noticed there's been a lot of fluctuation in how it answers questions because the guardrails coming up. So that intensity of regulation can have some very bad side effects, but I think it is necessary to have the discussions.
And what they're targeting also is very different.
It tends to be EU is again. We talked about that. They're trying to classify it, which I think is a good idea. Like saying high risk, medium. I think that's a good idea.
Well, you know what the U.S. is primarily focused on? According to, like, if I was going to sit down and summarize and say, okay, what's the U.S. focusing on? It's focusing on social media and bias.
Yeah, the word bias bothers me. Not because I think it doesn't exist, because I'm sure it does in many cases. We all know it exists in areas. When you have people that are labeling the data they're using to train these AIs, the people's biases are going to slip in. And it's very, very difficult to take that out, partly because the word bias, as an engineer, I have a difficult time. If you asked me to go evaluate the bias, like you mentioned, people in New York City, the HR stuff you
Yes.
mentioned earlier,
Yes.
how are you going to characterize bias in a way that you can look for it? I, bias to me, you and I talked about this the other day. When you look at the term bias, I think about protected classes. As I understand how the laws kind of progressed back in the 30s, they made a protected class because the robber barons, as they were called, the big businesses were using baseball bats to break up attempts at unionization. So they made the union members a protected class. Then that got expanded with civil rights in the 60s. And since then, there's been a lot of protected classes. So bias, I think, tends to be focused on these protected classes. But again, maybe somebody could post a comment and talk about what they think, how you would define a bias in this case. I think there's two types. I think there's an algorithmic bias, which is mathematically describable, and they can deal with that one. And then there's a bias based on what's socially acceptable. That's the one that's tough to deal with.
To me, I can be biased about my curly hair.
Well,
And
it's
one of the things to where it's, I agree with you
it's
100%. It is
societal.
very, very hard to define. It's very societal. And because artificial intelligence is such a worldwide scope, bias in one location is not going to be defined the same as bias in a different
That's
location.
correct, which is why it's going to be so. I'm not saying it's not a worthy problem to address. I don't envy the programmers and engineers and the people that actually have to try to implement this. We're back to that lobotomizing problem. You can get to the point where you try to remove the bias and you remove too much.
Right.
I guess we'll find out, because that is social media and bias is a very heavily focused in the U.S., especially when you start talking about elections and stuff.
Right. So the comparison of the paper that we were talking about earlier, if we look at the one in 1996 about the World Wide Web and we compare it, literally it is the same concerns in
Pretty much.
1996 as we are having today.
I think that, we did skip one little piece that I thought's worthy of talking about: biometrics and facial recognition. When I first started using artificial intelligence, I was focused on facial recognition. And as you know, I used to work for a biometrics company, so which was fingerprint sensors. But when you start talking about biometrics and facial recognition systems, I do have a problem with those. There is a lot of issues with not just the bias, but the ability for it to even accurately recognize people under different lighting conditions, things like that. I deal with that with security cameras. I'm not even trying to recognize who they are. I'm just trying to recognize that they're a person.
Right.
Lighting conditions and camera quality, there's so many variations. I would be hesitant to use that very seriously. That one kind of worries me a little bit. As you said,
artificial intelligence part of it, letting
Yes.
them do the
Yes.
recognition.
I think just don't take the humans out of the loop.
Okay.
If you're going to do that, that's fine, but be careful, because that bias we were talking about earlier, that thing will bite you so hard in biometrics and facial recognition systems that it's almost, you wonder, is it even worth it? we used to talk about in biometrics that multi-factor authentication was a better solution even in biometrics, because biometrics was one factor. In security, who you are, what you know, what you have. Those were kind of the pillars of identification, and the using the facial recognition piece was the same kind of problem. Use it, but use it lightly, I guess is my point.
Well, I think what you just said about keeping humans in the loop, I think when it comes right down to it, that is going to be something that we really need to continue.
Especially in the high risk areas, which is why I was kind of beating on that one a little bit. But back to your mentioning the paper, I actually pulled that up because Tim Berners-Lee is credited as, if not the, but at least one of the inventors of the World Wide Web, and his concerns in that paper, which I'm not even sure was ever published, but his concerns about privacy, safety, security, transparency, accountability, non-discrimination, and fairness, all of those were mentioned, and you see the same things coming out. So maybe we should learn from history a little bit, maybe read a history book and see how it was. Just go back in time and go back and look at some of this, how it was handled with the World Wide Web. I hope people are, at least the government officials are. So,
well, the World Wide Web changed information as we know it, and that's what artificial intelligence is doing now, is changing information.
Yeah.
So what we need to make sure of, or what we hope for, is that the governments continue to have a hands-off
light
approach.
Touch. Yeah,
a light touch is
I agree
a much
with you.
better way to put that. A light touch approach until everything
you kind of figure it out a little bit,
goes where it needs to go, and everyone figures it out.
If I get to have a say-so in this, if any government officials listening, please don't kill this. I really loved using this stuff. I use it almost every day. It's given me some opportunities to do, a lot of it is personal projects, but even things for the school district that I really, really like. I think it's interesting, the update on the United States, the Biden administration, and what they did, what they call
the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, the AI Bill of Rights. And it's, again, guidance and recommendations. Unfortunately, what is it? One of our superintendents used to say, things that aren't,
if they're not monitored, they are
optional.
Yeah.
So guidance and recommendations are okay, but if they're truly optional, people are only going to follow them if they don't lose money or they can make money by following them. But I think that there's enough companies. I am a little skeptical about all the companies out there that are talking about the importance of all this, because they all seem to be the big guys.
Right.
And the big guys have the money to deal with whatever the government throws at them, as long as it doesn't completely kill the market. So I'm a little concerned about who owns this and who's going to be making these rules. So if you're a government official, please listen to the little guys too, because we like to think we're important.
We are important.
I think so too.
So this is Mari and Jim, and we are AI in Action, exploring tomorrow's tech today. Thank you for listening, and we hope that you will listen in next time. And that brings us to the end of AI in Action, exploring tomorrow's tech today. We're Mari and Jim, your guides on this exciting journey through the world of artificial intelligence. We hope today's conversation has left you with fresh insights and a deeper understanding of how AI is shaping our future. If you enjoyed our discussion and want to stay up to date with the latest in AI, make sure to subscribe and share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. Remember, the future is not something that just happens to us. It's something we can actively shape and influence with knowledge and action. So let's continue exploring, innovating, and taking action. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to sharing more exciting AI developments with you next time on AI in Action, exploring tomorrow's tech today.